Hi and welcome everybody. I am just delighted that so many of you could come tonight to take part in this excellent event where we're going to learn and we're going to be able to become anti-plastic activists. We're going to be able to move ourselves and our communities beyond plastic. I'm Louise Bowditch. I'm co-coordinator of the Brookline Mothers Out Front Zero Waste team, along with Dean Cody, who is our compost queen. I'm going to introduce you to our speaker in a minute, but first a couple of Zoom rules. Please mute if you are not speaking. Please save your questions till after Judith's talk. Judith will speak for about 40 minutes. You're welcome during that time to type your questions into the chat, and I will read them to all of us at the end. As I said, Judith will speak for about 40 minutes and take questions for the remaining part of the hour that we have together. So if that's clear to everybody, remember, type your questions into the chat, save them all till the end. It's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce all of you to Judith Enck, our speaker tonight. Judith is the founder of the organization Beyond Plastics, which is on your screen. She is the former EPA Regional Administrator for the Northeast and Puerto Rico in the Obama administration. And she teaches a class at Bennington College, Beyond Plastics, that will make you a plastic expert in a short period of time. So without any more conversation, I will welcome Judith to our event tonight.
Thanks, Louise. What a privilege to be with all of you. Thanks for spending part of the evening with us. What else do we have to do on a Monday night but talk about the perils of plastic? So this is my name and my organization, Judith Enck. We have a really effective website. Write that down. If any of you are into Twitter the way I am, feel free to live tweet this talk. And I'm on Twitter at ENCKJ and also Plastics Beyond. So feel free to tag us. Next slide, please. As Louise mentioned, I used to work for this guy, No Drama Obama. It was quite an honor to work for the president. And in that capacity, I got to meet so many environmental leaders doing amazing work. And I want to say how impressed I am with Mothers Out Front, your leadership on composting, on gas hookups, is all really having an impact. And you should know that there's incredible work like this happening all across the country. And whenever I deal with Mothers Out Front, I think of that wonderful phrase, well-behaved women will never make history. So congratulations on your work, more to come. Next slide. It's so important to have bipartisan support on environmental protection. And that really started 51 years ago on the first Earth Day, where literally millions of people had events to commemorate the need to protect the Earth. Out of Earth Day, what president established the Environmental Protection Agency? Anyone remember? Richard Nixon. Nixon gave us the EPA, and that led to many federal environmental laws. Next slide, please. What was not envisioned back then was the fierce urgency of climate change. And I want to save you a lot of time and just say, if you want to be well informed on climate change, particularly students, read anything you can get your hands on by Bill McKibben. He's a visiting scholar at Middlebury College in Vermont. And he also has a weekly column in the New Yorker. Next slide. I am so impressed with the leadership by young people. This is Greta Thunberg, the teenage climate activist from Sweden. At the age of 17, she launched a student movement demanding action on climate change. Next slide. So what I want to talk about tonight is every component of the plastics issue. I'm concerned about plastics in the ocean, but I want to give you the full view. Certainly the ocean impacts are huge, but it's not the only issue. And the way I started working on this is the good thing about being appointed to your job by the President of the United States is you know when your last day on the job is. It's the day that he leaves office. You leave too, unless you really mess up and get fired earlier, which remarkably didn't happen to me because I was always pushing the envelope. So I literally had a couple years to really think on and reflect on what do I want to do next. And I did have a bunch of options, but I decided I wanted to work on an issue that was crucially important and where I felt like there was an unmet need, where there was just not enough public attention and political mobilization on. So the first thing I look at is the general issue of sustainability. So you can read these numbers for yourself. The US has 4% of the world's population. We use 17% of the world's energy, 24% of the world's natural resources, and generate 12% of the world's solid waste. This is not sustainable. Next slide. The US is ranked #1 as the world's largest generator of plastic waste at 42 metric tons. And the narrative of pointing fingers at other countries that don't have sophisticated solid waste infrastructure is just really fundamentally unfair. Plastic production has surged over the past 50 years from 15 million tons in 1964 to a whopping 311 million tons in 2014. And it's expected to double again over the next 20 years unless new laws and policies are put in place to change the pattern. You should know that half of all plastic ever made was made since 1950. So we have an opportunity to change course, and we have to. We are turning our oceans into landfills. I think this is an underestimate, but roughly 15 million tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. A lot of this plastic will break up, but it will never biodegrade. It will outlive all of us. Unless things change, and I mean systemic change, by 2025, for every 3 pounds of fish in the ocean, there will be 1 pound of plastic. Next slide, please. I want that to really sink in. And when I was at EPA thinking about what do I want to do when I grow up, this statistic just stopped me in my tracks. And it's the smaller pieces of plastic that are a greater problem. You've heard the phrase microplastics, that those are little pieces of plastics that are 5 millimeters or less. It's about the size of a grain of salt. Let me explain why this is a problem. You're walking down a city street, somehow a plastic water bottle or a plastic bag gets littered. It rains, the plastic water bottle gets washed into the storm sewer. It then avoids the sewage treatment plant, goes right into the river. And then all rivers, as you know, eventually lead to the ocean. A plastic bottle, a plastic bag gets out into the ocean. It's very sunny, which makes the plastic brittle. And there's a lot of wave action back and forth. That brittle plastic then is subjected to almost what's like a paper cutter. So one single plastic bottle becomes hundreds or thousands of smaller pieces of plastic, which then gets eaten by fish and seabirds and marine life and sometimes humans. The United Nations has documented 663 species have been impacted by plastic pollution. Next slide. I'm particularly concerned about seabirds. This is not an outlier. This is quite a common sight on many isolated islands, for instance, in the Pacific. What happens a lot is the seabirds see red or orange plastic. They think it's shrimp and they try to eat it. For the mature seabirds, they consume the plastic. So you see all that plastic in this photo is in their gut. They feel full. And so they don't eat real food and get the calories that they need. They'll also bring bits of plastic back to the nests and feed it to chicks. And the chicks will sometimes choke on the plastic. You've also probably heard of the big floating islands of plastics known as gyres. They do exist. Some of them are the size of the state of Texas, but I want you to get that out of your mind. That's very visual, but most of the plastic in the ocean doesn't rest on the surface. It falls down to the sea floor, making it almost impossible to remove. So those are kind of the basics on the ocean. Next slide. We can't solve the climate change crisis without solving the plastic pollution problem. Plastics are made from chemicals and fossil fuels. You know this, most fossil fuels are coal, oil, and gas. And for years, plastic was made from chemicals and oil. But today, plastics, 99% are made from chemicals and ethane, which is a byproduct from hydrofracking. Next slide, please. The boom in fracking has spurred new investment in plastic manufacturing. Many are still in the planning stages, but about 47 ethane cracker plants are currently in permitting, meaning various government agencies are looking at handing them possible permits, mostly in Texas and Louisiana. So this is not to scale, but this is what a fracking site looks like. And follow that arrow. You see the orange ethane gas. Today, that ethane gas is typically vented into the atmosphere. And it's a very potent greenhouse gas, worse than CO2. What we're seeing now is many proposals to build pipelines to take that ethane gas and to bring it to what's called an ethane cracker facility. Next slide, please. So there are dozens of proposals to build facilities like this one. This will be connected to a series of pipelines. The ethane is sent here. It's heated to a very high temperature and cracked. That's why it has this funny name, ethane cracker. And what happens at a facility like this? They make the major ingredients for making plastic packaging, single-use plastic packaging. So a lot of people don't know this. You've heard it here tonight. This is an ethylene cracker plant, most proposed in Louisiana and Texas, but also the Ohio River Valley, West Virginia. This one you're looking at is in Pennsylvania. This is under construction in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, and it's being built by the little mom and pop company called Shell Appalachia. It is also being built with tax dollars from the state of Pennsylvania. Here are a few things you need to know about ethane crackers. They are super emitters of greenhouse gases. State and federal permits allow them to, this one facility to emit 2.2 million pounds of carbon dioxide a year to make single-use plastic packaging. And it'll make single-use plastic packaging even cheaper than it is today. And that's why a lot of businesses use polystyrene and single-use plastic packaging. It's not because they want to hurt the earth, but because it's cheap. It's called, Mary, it's called both things, ethane cracker and ethylene cracker. You can use either. According to the Center for International Environmental Law, if plastic production and use grows as currently predicted, by 2030, the emissions from these ethane cracker plants will be about 1.3 gigatons each year. That is the equivalent to the emissions released by more than 295 new 500 megawatt coal-fired power plants. So just think of how long it's taken to shut down coal-fired power plants. And if the plastic production proceeds, we will be releasing the same greenhouse gas emissions as 295 new medium-sized coal-fired power plants. So what's going on, and I don't think policymakers fully understand this, is that plastic production has become the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. Just think about what you're reading in the media every day. We're seeing this fabulous growth in renewable energy, new solar, new wind turbines, new geothermal, new small-scale hydro taking off. So that means less demand for fossil fuel for electricity generation. And then on the transportation side, we're seeing more electric vehicles, more investments in mass transit, walkable communities, bikeable communities, safer bike trails. So less demand for fossil fuel for transportation. So plan B for the fossil fuel industry is to shift to plastic production. Next slide. Unfortunately, this is an environmental justice issue. This is Sharon Levine. She heads up an organization called Rise St. James in Louisiana. We know that the oil and gas and chemical and plastic facilities almost are always located in low-income communities and communities of color. Sharon is fighting an ethane cracker plant in her community because it's a major source of air and water pollution. In addition to emitting greenhouse gases, they emit benzene, volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and particulates. The facility she is opposing is proposed by Formosa Plastics out of Taiwan. And I maintain that if this was proposed in a more affluent community, it would be blocked. Sharon is a retired special ed teacher, and she now spends almost every waking hour trying to block this Formosa plastic plant. And what we've seen, and she will succeed because she is right, and she's fighting the good fight. But what we see is a lot of these companies really focus on communities of least resistance. For instance, Manchester, Texas is home to one of the largest petrochemical complexes in the whole world. 90% of the residents in this town live within 1 mile of a chemical facility, and 97% of these people are people of color. The Union of Concerned Scientists, a wonderful organization based in Boston, I think, they looked at the most dangerous toxic air pollutants in the Houston area. 4 of the 6 are related to making plastics. So that's the environmental justice issue that is so important here. Next slide. Plastic pollution is also a health issue. That's probably a familiar scene to all of us, even if you shop at a food co-op. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it's not good to breathe in or eat plastics, period. 42% of plastics ever produced is for plastic packaging. A lot of this packaging lasts for an hour or so, and then it's with us for decades or centuries. Food packaging is a particular concern because plastic packaging has toxic additives, and chemicals can migrate from the packaging into the food. Some of the plastic degrades into the food if the plastic comes into contact with acidic food or heat. So for instance, never have a cup of tea in a polystyrene cup, because that acid is going to result in some leaching into your beverage. Next slide, please. If you learn nothing else tonight, I want to make sure you know not to use microwavable popcorn. It used to be a staple in our house, but the chemical PFOA is used in a lot of food packaging where they try to keep things grease resistant. And we know that PFOA in drinking water has been known to cause kidney and testicular cancers, thyroid disease, and other illnesses. So I never eat microwavable popcorn. We know that plastics are showing up in our bodies when tested. Next slide. Something that we learned quite recently is that each of us, every one of us, are breathing in or consuming the equivalent of 1 credit card size of plastic every week. So something this size, we're either drinking it or we are breathing in microplastics into our body. And health researchers really need to focus on what microplastics are doing to the lining of our stomachs, and are they being absorbed by the bloodstream? We don't fully know. Next slide. One paper that caught my eye was this past January in the scientific journal Environmental International. A group of Italian scientists documented in a peer-reviewed paper for the first time the presence of microplastics in the human placenta. It was found on both the maternal side of the placenta and the fetal side of the placenta. Let that sink in. Next slide. So we need a lot more research on what happens to our bodies when we eat and drink microplastics. It cannot be good. Next slide. One of my favorite scientists in this area is Dr. Sherry Mason from Penn State. She has looked at microplastics in drinking water, twice as much microplastics in bottled water than in tap water. Next slide. There's plastic in seafood, especially shrimp and mussels and oysters, any kind of seafood that you eat whole. Next slide. Before I get to this, I also want to mention an important book that just came out by Dr. Shauna Swan called Countdown, and it deals with reproductive toxins and reduced sperm counts. She has a whole chapter on plastics. So you're probably sitting there getting a little worried and thinking, well, can't we just recycle all of these plastics? What really is the problem? And the problem is, as much as I support recycling, when I was home on maternity leave with my son, I started our town's first mandatory recycling program. So I'm a big, big booster of recycling. Keep recycling: metal, glass, cardboard, paper. Of course, source separate your yard waste and your food waste and compost it. But plastic recycling has been an abysmal failure. Next slide. We're only hitting about an 8.5% plastic recycling rate. So the solution, obviously, is to stop making so much plastic. It's kind of fundamental. Next slide. If you do want to recycle plastics, only put number 1 and number 2 plastic in your recycling bin. Most other plastics do not get recycled. And you can see those shrinking tiny numbers inside the recycling logo. So we can't recycle our way out of the problem. Companies that make plastic are pushing personal responsibility rather than laws and accountability that address the problem on a larger scale. Where have we heard this before? I try to avoid plastic, but it's unavoidable if you are an American consumer. So the solution is making less plastic, and the solution is becoming informed and active. It was a really hard 4 years during the Trump administration on environmental issues. And so I share this slide because this was at a rally in Albany on opposing offshore oil and gas drilling in the Atlantic. And plus, that's my favorite sign that I bring to climate change events, Polars for Solar. And you might remember we won. We blocked offshore oil and gas drilling, and now we're seeing offshore wind. So become informed, take action. I recently established an organization called Beyond Plastics, which is a national project based at Bennington College. And as Louise mentioned, and I'll talk about later, take my online class on plastic pollution. The next class starts in September. It's a fun class. It's public policy with a real focus on public action. And it's interesting. I've only offered the class online 3 times. Most of the students are community people who are auditing the class. There are alternatives to plastic. Next slide. So again, for plastic recycling, that's information on the class. For plastic recycling, only put number 1 and number 2 plastics in your recycling bin. There are a handful of communities that take number 5, but I have real questions about what even happens to the number 5 plastics. Next slide. So we don't need this massive engineering breakthrough to reduce plastics. Look in your own refrigerator or your own cupboards. My husband loves orange juice, even though I tell him it has too much sugar in it. And I knew that we were buying so much orange juice in plastic containers. So we shifted to frozen concentrate, and our personal plastic use went way down. We need to see more and more refillables and reusables. We're seeing some slow but important progress in that direction. There are companies like Loop, where you can buy consumer products in reusable metal packaging, and then you send it back to them. There are a number of innovations, but also basic stuff like shopping at a food co-op and bringing your own glass jars for your food. That should ease up post-COVID. There are places like Zero Waste Outlet that has lots of options. I've noticed some companies that make laundry detergents have shifted to really concentrated laundry products that reduces plastic. But the problem with all of this is that it's not happening quickly enough and it's not at scale, even though there are great ideas out there. Next slide. A couple recent things that I've noticed is I worked with students and staff at the State University of New York, SUNY New Paltz. They convinced the school to stop having plastic bottles in vending machines. They only have aluminum cans. You can replicate that on any campus or any business that has vending machines. A project that we are launching at Beyond Plastics is trying to get Meals on Wheels, that wonderful organization, to shift to reusable packaging. And the way that that came about was, the nice thing about Beyond Plastics is that we're small and we endeavor to answer every phone call and every email. And one day I got an email from Mary from Buffalo, New York, who's a Wheels on Meals volunteer. And she was concerned that her local Meals on Wheels shifted from cardboard packaging to plastic, and particularly black plastic, which she knew was not recyclable, because when black plastic goes to recycling facilities, the sensors can't read black color. So all black plastic gets buried or burned. It doesn't get recycled. So we had a back and forth and decided, wouldn't it be interesting to try to get Meals on Wheels to shift to reusable trays, because you have a built-in return system. Meals on Wheels is really managed locally. Only 35% of their funding comes from the federal government. So if you are interested in helping us, we are looking from volunteers all over the country to work with their local Meals on Wheels and convince them to shift to reusable packaging. And we'll make it really easy for you. We have information on where to get the reusables. We've got fact sheets. We have a staff person who has a background in nutrition. Those are the sort of things that will change the trajectory of what's going on with the plastics issue. But ultimately, we need new laws and new regulations to affect systemic change. I'm a former federal regulator, so I'm always going to suggest changing the laws and then having strong regulations that go with the laws. So on our website, we have a model local law called the Plastic Trifecta. What it entails is it bans plastic bags. It puts a minimum fee on paper bags, plastic straws only upon request. It bans polystyrene food packaging, also known as styrofoam. And then we added a couple new provisions, like prohibiting intentional balloon releases, because balloons are made often from plastic. So we are available to help citizens who want to work on the plastic trifecta at the state or local level. We provided technical assistance to environmentalists in Vermont and New Jersey. Both states have the plastic trifecta on the books. In fact, New Jersey banned both paper and plastic bags. So how do you start with all of this? This is one concrete thing you can do. Next slide, please. There are lots of good examples from around the world. The world is too big to fail, so we have to share each other's ideas. The European Union, for instance, banned 10 different single-use plastic items effective this year. There are different state bills introduced, and now for the first time ever, we have a comprehensive federal bill in the Congress introduced that addresses the plastic pollution problem in a serious way. Next slide. It's called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And I'll give you the bill numbers. It's Senate Bill 984, House Bill 2238. And both of your US senators from Massachusetts are co-sponsors of this bill, but we need to get more House co-sponsors. And what's motivating action on this bill is concern about climate change. We really can't solve climate change without reducing single-use plastic packaging. Because of the urgency, we really have to act. The planet is warming. Next slide, please. This is a typical scene that you just saw after a hurricane. This is a picture from Puerto Rico. Louise mentioned that when I served at the EPA, my region was New York, New Jersey, 8 Indian nations in New York, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and Hurricane Irma, 2 hurricanes within 1 week, it devastated the island. Many places in Puerto Rico didn't get their power back for over 9 months. And some people died during the hurricane, but almost 4,000 people died from not having electricity. And just briefly, I want to mention that climate change doesn't cause hurricanes, but what happens is when the water is warmer, the water in the ocean, the water in the Caribbean Sea, when that water is warmer, it serves almost like rocket fuel for hurricanes. So the hurricanes are stronger. A class 1 hurricane becomes a class 3 hurricane. And we know that the planet is warming. Next slide. 2020 tied with 2016 is the hottest year on record. The United Nations says we have roughly 10 years to avoid catastrophic climate change. But I would argue that catastrophic climate change is here now. You remember the Australia wildfires? 1 billion animals died in that. And then, of course, the California wildfires last summer in Colorado and Washington State. And I'm really concerned about this summer in California with intense drought. So climate change is here. Next slide. We know what to do. We need to shift to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and we need to stop producing more and more plastic, relying on fracking. So we can change this. Next slide, please. I have a personal question for each of you. Are you in? You can work with Mothers Out Front on the plastics issue locally. Next slide. Beyond Plastics is a resource for you. Follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Someone asked earlier where to get more information. Next slide, please. There's lots of good information on our website and many other websites. We're not the only kid on the block on this, although we really try to collect useful information. If you're so inclined, financially support us, donating on our website or by mailing an old-fashioned check. Next slide. We are a spunky environmental startup with the really big goal of ending plastic pollution everywhere. Now, if you missed anything of what I covered tonight, all you have to do is watch John Oliver's segment on plastic pollution, which ran on March 21st. It's as if he took my class. I will tell you though, he uses some very salty language. So I apologize in advance, and don't watch it with little kids in the room, maybe teenagers, but not little kids. I just wish he didn't swear so much. The substance of his presentation is spot on. And in 20 minutes, you will learn this issue and you will laugh a lot. So John Oliver has a show on HBO called, I don't remember the name of it, but just Google John Oliver show on plastic, March 21st, and you will be treated to a factually accurate and funny presentation on the plastic issue, which I deeply appreciate because these issues can get a little discouraging and down sometimes. So using humor to educate people on this issue is incredibly important. Another movie you should check out is called The Story of Plastic, which is put out by a great organization called The Story of Stuff. Unfortunately, because of the distribution rights, you have to, I think you all showed it, you have to show it to a group, but you can also, Last Week Tonight is the name of the show, but you can also get the story of plastic on various different apps. Discovery Channel aired it last Earth Day, so it's also on the Discovery app. So with this great picture of John Oliver, I will leave it at that, and then very happy to take any questions from Louise, who will be looking at the chat.
Thanks so much, Judith. That was terrific. And we have watched both the Oliver performance, if you will, and the movie, and they're terrific. There's a lot of information, a lot of questions that are covering the same ground, but I want to say a couple of things first. Tomorrow, everyone who is on this call, this presentation at this event, will receive a thank you letter. And at the bottom of the thank you letter, there are going to be links for you to check out. One, to Judith's class to make it easy for you to sign up. And two, for the newsletter of Beyond Plastics. It's very informative. And many of you are looking for information. And I would say there's going to be a couple of links tomorrow that will be helpful to you.
Louise, I'm just going to jump in and say, if you didn't register in advance for this event, you won't receive that email. So if you got the Zoom link from a friend, just put your email in the chat so we can make sure that we include you in that email follow-up.
Thanks, Anne. A number of people, Judith, are interested in resources to learn more. We have started our own process of learning and then ultimately sharing in our zero waste team. But from you, the expert, could you give people, you want to send them to a particular list, you want to give them a list orally right now, but to help people get started on learning?
Sure. Well, a few resources. Even before I offered my online class on plastic pollution, which starts again September 1st, I taught this class at Bennington College to college students in a classroom with people. It was amazing. I miss that. I'm going to do it again in September also for the Bennington students. There's no textbook on plastic pollution yet. So what I do for my class is I just compile the latest good, accurate information that I can find. But there is something I would recommend called the Plastic Atlas, and it's not very thick, and it's filled with good information. It's from Germany, and you can download it, or you can order one from Germany. But I think the easiest thing is you can download it.
You can download it because I did.
What did you downloaded it, Louise?
I downloaded it. There's a woman on this call named Inga, and Inga sent me the link and I downloaded it. Inga, I think it's German. And she sent me this link and it's fabulous.
Yeah.
This Plastic Atlas that's a good one. Inga, if you're on the call, could you put the link in the chat, please?
I do have it here. I just found it. We can type it in. So it's www. Did someone type it in while I say it? Because I can't do both.
Yeah.
So it's there. Sue, you got it. Plastic Atlas. Perfect. So it's only about 50 pages, and it's really comprehensive. And the Europeans are ahead of us. So I definitely recommend this. The Beyond Plastics website, another website.
Above the Fold sometimes has interesting stuff. I get that on a regular basis.
Yep. So that comes out every Monday morning. Yep. The website of Plastic Pollution Coalition, and then in your backyard, Conservation Law Foundation does some really good work on plastic. They cover many other issues.
Yeah,
but you definitely should
cover plastic. Okay, another question. Someone wants to know the number of times that plastic can be recycled.
Yeah, that is such a good question, because it's not like an aluminum can that gets recycled over and over again. It rarely gets recycled into what it was before. and it loses its polymer strength every time it goes around. So Massachusetts has a bottle bill. So that's one of the most effective ways to get plastic recycling. Most of that beverage container plastic gets recycled into things like carpet, clothing, decking material, like instead of a wooden deck, you have a plastic deck, because plastics by definition do not lend themselves to go around much and not into things that they were. You are probably seeing some national advertising by the beverage industry called Every Bottle Back. And the way they would get every bottle back is if they would support a national bottle bill with deposits. But there's very little bottle to bottle plastic recycling going on. So the answer most of the time is never.
Mostly less than 9% is ever recycled, right?
Correct. But then the 8.5% that is recycled is rarely recycled into the same product it came from.
Isn't that called downcycled or something?
Yes,
like
downcycling. Yeah.
Okay. I want to add something here for people who've been writing in the chat about places to get plastic bottles refilled. There's in the chat, there's information about the place in Cambridge called Clean Something. In Brookline, the general store in Coolidge Corner has a small refill section in the back of the store. I think on the most of the time you can find out this kind of information on the Mothers Out Front site. We'll be posting more and more of these kinds of resources because people are eager to try their best. But let's listen up to what Judith's real message is, which is what we have to have is systemic change. We all will feel a lot better if we're doing our part, but we need to change this system. We need to stop hydrofracking totally, period, full stop, and get that methane and ethane out of the system. I'm sorry, that's just my little speech. Another question we had was, what about the potential for plant-based plastic?
Aha, good question. Well, we've been hearing about plant-based plastic for about 30 years, and it hasn't quite worked. There are some notable exceptions. There's a little company north of Albany called Ecovative Design. It was started by a couple RPI students. They make an alternative to polystyrene from agricultural waste, but it can't be used for food grade packaging. And there's like one other company like them in the whole country. So bio-based plastics, interesting concept. We have to be careful when the bio-based plastic says that it's compostable. Yeah. You don't want to put that in your backyard composting bin. It can only go to high temperature commercial composting operations. So I would say on bio-based plastics, compostable plastics, I appreciate the effort. I appreciate that it's not fossil fuel, but not quite ready for prime time. Again, much better option is to shift to reusables and refillables.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any other questions that I haven't covered that anybody wants to just raise their hand maybe right now and jump in? Because I think I have covered everything that was asked in the chat. There are a lot of suggestions from people.
It looks like Maya Norton is raising her hand.
Okay, Maya.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Judith. I have a question. I used to live in Israel. What? Anyway, I used to live in Israel, and they had a kind of plastic there that was much more I don't want to say propaganda, but like the information about it was that it was much more biodegradable and it broke down much more quickly. But I'm wondering from your presentation now if it just became microplastic faster and didn't actually biodegrade into something usable or actually biodegradable. So I wondered if you were familiar with that and you could comment on it.
Yeah, I would need to know precisely what the type of plastic it was, but Maya, you put your finger on it. On a certain level, I mean, don't quote me on this. You can quote me on everything else, but don't quote me on the following. I'd rather have like one intact plastic bottle than hundreds of different pieces of plastic that's only partially decomposed from a plastic bottle. That poses a greater risk to fish and wildlife. I've been waiting for the plastic breakthrough and I have not seen it. So, and I've seen plastic recycling really fail. So we got to move on and just stop using so much plastic.
We have Brian. You want to unmute, Brian? I see your hand is up. There you go.
Thank you, Louise. My question is about large-scale recovery of plastic and use for in road pavement. There have been projects done in India. It's been done quite a lot. Many miles of road have been built with recycled plastic as an ingredient, and Australia as well. And the plastic actually contributes positive attributes to the pavement surface. And I wonder if you think that's a viable thing since we have such an enormous amount of material to get rid of.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Brian. I don't think it's a good strategy for a couple of reasons. One is the abrasion from the tires when it hits the road releases microplastics into the air and into the water. There's a really good paper by Dr. Janice Brahney, Brahney at the University of Utah, where she looked at the presence of microplastics in remote national parks out west and found a disturbing amount of microplastics in remote areas. And her hypothesis is that most of it came from roadways, and that's tires. So you add the abrasion of the tires on the roadway and you've got a greater problem. You might be able to mitigate it a little bit by making sure the plastic is not on the top surface, but further down in the road construction. But two other problems. One is, we're building a lot of new roads, but it's not going to use the massive amount of plastic that is being produced. So it's not really going to handle a lot of the problem. And then the other thing is I want everyone to keep thinking about the front end production problems with plastic, the plastic manufacturing, the picture of Sharon Levine. Sharon lives in an area called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and we don't want to normalize that phrase. There's such a concentration of cancer in parts of Louisiana and Texas because of the petrochemical industry. So I think it's upon all of us to think of the whole life cycle, not kind of a niche possible end use for plastic. And on the issue of roads, I'm worried about the abrasion causing microplastics. And again, it's just not going to handle the massive quantity of plastics that we have.
Okay. Thank you so much, Judith, and thanks to all of you who participated tonight. Please be sure that you look up the resources that are going to be in the chat, which is saved, and that are also going to be tomorrow in your thank you letter, and the ones that Judith has mentioned. There is in the chat a possibility for you to become even more involved, which would be to join our zero waste campaign, the plastics component of it, the sponsor of the event tonight. And in the chat, there is a link that takes you right to sign up for that. We have a meeting coming up at the end of the month, the 23rd. So you would all be welcome. But thank you so much, Judith. This was great.
My pleasure.
Before
Thank you,
we
Louise.
sign
Thank
off,
you, Ann.
Can we make sure we take a picture just as part of our thank you?
I always forget. We need a picture. Okay.
Great. So if everybody could turn on their video just for this 1 minute, it's not a beauty contest, but it does make a difference to see all your smiling faces to show that there's the huge number of people
Huge
supporting this
number of
effort
people.
to
They're
get
gonna
beyond
look great
plastic.
because there's so many of us.
Great. All right. So I'm going to count to 3 and then take a picture. So 1, 2, 3. Yay.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks again, everybody.
Good night.
Let's get beyond plastic. Thanks, Judith.
Thank you so much, Louise. Thanks for organizing this, Louise and Ann. It was really nice. Thank you. Bye.
Excellent. Bye.
Thank you.